I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is Scald. You're about to hear a chapter of the only story that matters. Every week, I write a brand new episode of this ongoing sword and sorcery serial, and then I record it in one single, flawless take. No one else does that. It picks up right where the last episode left off, but you should absolutely feel free to jump in right here. Or you can go back and listen to previous episodes, or even check out the prose volumes on Amazon. But more on that a little bit later. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is Scald, part 34. Xylan awoke, howling, caught in a blinding flash of light. With that searing whiteness still impeding his vision, he gnashed his bestial teeth and lashed out with his fur-covered paws, desperate to tear skin, to rend flesh, to crack bones, to revel in grim, bloody mortality. And laugh. Lie to me? Deceive me? He cackled and snarled at the old wizard, the one who had put a stop to his attack before sending him careening into slumber. With his vision slowly returning, Xylan scrambled to his feet. I like a trick, but I love a joke. Come closer, let me tell you. But as he began to make sense of his surroundings, the godless monk realized that the wizard, the bald-headed old man with the distinctive purple birthmark, was nowhere to be found. In fact, no one was anywhere to be found. Nothing was to be found there, as Xylan found himself in a dim, barren, lifeless tundra, dimly lit by a quickly setting sun. For the first time since he transformed, since he devolved, since he changed, Xylan slowed. He stopped. He looked down and took stock of himself. He gazed down at his hands. No. And his paws, tipped with short, blunt, black claws, claws that flexed and quivered as he stared at them, claws that wanted to be out, to be free, to sink into flesh and tear, to carve out red gashes, gushing rivers of gore, to give rise to the immortal, timeless joke of... No. Xylan closed his eyes, and he shook his head, desperate to blot out the images of rushing blood and pumping viscera that filled his mind. He stood for a moment, motionless, silent, but his attention was divided by that sound, that horrible giggling, sadism fighting for attention with masochism, driven to distraction by that laugh. With horror creeping across his consciousness, he realized the truth. It was his laugh. He clamped his jaws shut in disgust, in horror, in embarrassment, mortified at what he'd become, of how he'd been changed. He wasn't always this way. He used to believe. He was a believer. It's why he had joined the monastery, why he'd sequestered himself away, given up everything, given himself to something larger, something bigger, something better than himself. He raised his eyelids slowly, forcing himself to look at himself, to gaze upon what he'd become. Devoid of belief, bereft of faith, he'd become hardened, become stronger. He'd split from the whole, but instead of becoming merely a piece, unfinished and broken, he redefined the boundaries. He created himself. and he was content, if not happy. But now it was different. Now he was different. He laughed, but he was not happy. His mirth sprang forth from malice. His joy manifested in jeers. He laughed at a joke that only he knew and that he hated more than anything. He laughed with no one, but at everything. So he clenched his sharp, hateful teeth, anything to stop that cackle, the one that rose unbidden from deep within, from a place beyond any depths that he had been brave enough to plumb. He succeeded, just barely, in stifling his laughter, in keeping it inside, keeping it deep down, keeping it somewhere dark and cold and vicious, keeping it where it belonged. In succeeding, the laugh was replaced with heavy breathing, and as he opened his eyes, he could see the end of that elongated snout stretched out unnaturally before him. He could see his wet, black nose quivering and pulsating, rising and falling as his nostrils flared with every panicked breath. How had this happened? How had this befallen him? The witch doctors. Yes, those sneering little monsters. They had done this to him. They had changed him. But how did this happen? How did he turn into this? The moon. That nightly deceiver, rising like an echo of the sun, casting light upon the earth, a light reflected, mirrored, and diminished, an approximation of the sun, a mockery, a cheap imitation. A deceitful, lying light that brought out the truth of who he was, of what he was, of what he'd become. Xylan, clasping his hands together, anything to keep his fingers from flexing, anything to keep those claws in check. The godless monk turned to the horizon, turned to that dim, laughable sun. It had nearly set, had nearly finished its cowardly retreat beyond the rocky landscape. It had ceded its position in the sky to that prime deceiver, that willful equivocator, that nightly liar, the moon that hung, though in a different world, as full as it had been in the one that he had left behind. But suddenly, the moon and that sun, offensive in its inadequacy, reprehensible in its failure, they weren't the only lights in that barren tundra. In the distance, as far as his feral eyes could see in the dimming light, a flash, a blinding flash of burning white, so bright that even at a distance it seared an afterimage into his corneas, a glowing orb that burned into his eyes, into his very brain, threatening to overtake him with the whiteness that had so recently relinquished its hold upon him. He winced, carelessly allowing a sinister chuckle to escape from his jaws, left unguarded as he attended his eyes. The laugh slipped out, made more aggressive, more base, more iniquitous by his efforts to contain it. He clamped his animal jaws shut once again, and he turned back to investigate the light. But as he did so, the landscape lit up once again. This time, Xylan was wise enough, quick enough, clever enough to avert his eyes, to look away, to only gaze upon the flash with his peripheral vision. And he was well served by it. This burst was closer, nearer to him, reachable with a 2-day march. He felt the muscles in his arms and legs twitch, causing his yellow and black fur to rub against what remained of his tattered robes. 2 days. Less if he ran, less if he leaned into what he was, if he gave into it, if he put his hands upon the rocky, craggy earth and ran like the beast he had become. The beast that he was. He could do it. He could reach the closer flash and find the brutal Maul, his brutal pet Skog. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Did he want to find them? He didn't even know. No, he did know. They were cold comfort. They were savage companions, dangerous to throw in with, but they were better than being left alone, left to laugh himself into madness, into lunacy, into idiocy. And anyway, who else did he have? Who else would have him? What else should he do? What else could he do? He could reach the closer flash, the one that lay just behind the tower. The tower. It had been there before and he just hadn't noticed. His mind was spinning, whirling so quickly that he could barely keep track of his thoughts. So it was possible. Had it been lost in the weak, shimmering rays of the sun? Had he been so focused on himself, on his new, horrible body, that he could look over something so massive? Or did it just appear there, summoned forth, urged into action by the now complete absence of that world sun? He didn't know. He couldn't tell. And he didn't care. He set off walking toward the tower. What else could he do? What else should he have done? Though his paws wanted to touch the rocks of the tundra, wanted his back to curve, wanted to stretch down and pound upon the earth, he denied them. He refused them, and though it pained him, he forced his body to walk upright, like the man he had once been and still believed, still wished himself to be. But as he walked, he saw that he was not alone. He was surrounded by glowing green eyes filling the black caves that dotted the landscape, heaving, rising and falling like obscene fireflies, like wicked embers upon the wind. He did his best to pay them no mind, to keep his big, black, empty eyes on the goal, on the tower, to put one foot ahead of the other and move. But before long, the embers had risen out of the caves, the fireflies fluttered out into the open, and Xylan found himself surrounded. Even observing them from the corner of his eyes, they filled him with revulsion, a primal, atavistic feeling of disgust, of hatred, of condemnation and contempt. Their nescient eyes, slack-jawed mouths, their obscene noses, and long, knobby limbs, all of them, from matted head to filthy toe, covered with foul, rotting flesh, green with decay, puffy with infection. They were vile. They were odious. They were trolls. And they surrounded him. So quick as to feel impossible, the landscape had filled with trolls. And try as he might, it was impossible for Xylan to avoid looking at them, to refrain from staring, to keep his eyes from gazing upon their vulgar forms. So he gave in. He swallowed the bile that rose up in his throat, and he stared back at the trolls. He looked out at their hideous, lumpen bodies, and though he called upon every muscle in his long, fur-covered head, though he forbade each and every one from moving an inch, it didn't matter. Xylan, the godless monk, that bestial scavenger, broke out into a riotous, convulsing laugh. Of their own volition, Xylan's shoulders raised, his back arched, and his paws stretched toward the ground, just as they had wanted. And meanwhile, the trolls did as they wanted, their vile nature fueled by the sound of Xylan's echoing laughter. The trolls, before they had moved uniformly, though in no apparent order. But now they changed course, turning their glowing green eyes toward the godless monk. But the more they turned toward him, the closer they drew, the more clearly he could see the senseless hatred, the gleeful ignorance in their eyes. The more he was compelled to do but one thing: laugh. He laughed. He laughed and he laughed. What else could he do? These things, these lumpy monstrosities, a mockery of life, just as this world's sun was a mockery of a true light bringer. That joke of a star failed to bring light into the world, failed to illuminate, to elucidate, to make clear, to burn away the haze of ignorance. So in that stinking miasma, in that dismal stew, what else would you expect to grow? What else but heaving abominations, foul perversions, abhorred by man and nature alike? But like the best jokes, like the ones that strike to the core, like the ones that make you laugh, make you suffer, and make you laugh again to cover up the ache, this joke was loaded, was weighted with something damaging, something deadly. It bore the inevitable. It held the truth. On a long enough timeline, this is what awaited him, what awaited everyone, what awaited every realm, the sundered worlds, and all of existence. The sun would go out. Civilizations would fall. Man's accumulated knowledge, his creations, his great works, they would be broken, cast down, shattered into rubble. Man himself would devolve, would become a parody of itself, become less than a beast, and the lights would finally, mercifully, go out. Xylan saw this. He saw all of it. He saw it, he knew, and most importantly, he laughed. He laughed because it was true, laughed because it hurt him inside, laughed because there was nothing else to be done. He laughed and he laughed at the cosmic joke that was made at all of creation's expense. He laughed until tears filled his big, black, empty eyes, laughed until his obscene pink tongue lolled out of his mouth, laughed until his cackles filled the ears of every stupid, ignorant troll with feet upon the ground. He laughed. And the trolls, once united in their stumbling, shambling assault, in their foolish march, they faltered, they wavered, they ceased dragging their bulk across the earth, and they halted, they stopped, they stood transfixed by the cackling, howling, crying, hunched-over beast that had inserted itself into the world, into their world, into a world that they had thought theirs for generations. The beast had arrived unbidden, had erupted into laughter, and it had upended everything. The trolls, those nescient beasts, they knew nothing. They knew less than nothing, but they could tell. There was no avoiding a fact that was clearer than knowledge, more self-evident than wisdom itself. They could tell that though they knew nothing, They could tell that Xylan, the godless monk, the laughing scavenger before them, that he feared even less. Suddenly, the joke was too much for even Xylan to handle, too much hilarity for that twitching jester to keep locked up inside of him, too much quivering lunacy to be contained. And so the godless monk let it out in the only way he knew how, in the only way he could, in the only expression that joke had ever known, the only one it would ever know. He let it out in teeth, in claws, in striking movements, and for a moment the laughter halted, a brief respite, just long enough for Xylan to tear out the throat of a poor, unlucky troll. But soon enough, the hilarity returned, the awful laughter, the hideous cackles. They all came flooding back, louder than ever, more terrible than could even be imagined, as they were bolstered by what fuels the truest, the most cutting, the most vicious, the funniest jokes. Pain, suffering, death, and the bubbling, steaming crimson that stained the rattling jaws of Xylan, the godless monk. The gore, the ichor, and that dripping, horrible joke matted his fur, dyed a sickening shade of pink in the shimmering moonlight. Though the hilarity still consumed him, though his unstoppable laughter made speech impossible, Xylan shrugged his shoulders and began to move steadily, once again, toward the tower. His hands stretched down to the ground, guiding him over the broken rubble, the ruined stone, providing necessary assistance as he navigated that shattered landscape, helping him scramble across the rocks. A brief moment, given over reluctantly to his bestial nature, nothing more. All as the trolls looked on in shock. The trolls. Xylan let out a sadistic guffaw as he thought about them. They stood and they watched in horror, having just learned the meaning of terror, of a fear that goes beyond death, of a fear that rode upon every laugh, every snicker, every chuckle that came out of the godless monk's blood-stained mouth. The fear of nothing, that there is nothing, that none of it matters, that in the end there is nothing. He had taught them fear, and he had been such a good teacher, such an efficient, engaging tutor, such a brilliant professor. He had taught them, and they had learned well. They'd excelled in their studies because now they stood paralyzed, only moving to clear a path for that heinous, cackling monster, the one whose very voice blasted their shriveled minds with life, then filled them with that forbidden knowledge, the knowledge too terrible to embrace, but too powerful to ignore, that there's nothing more, there's nothing beyond, and you, in all your blustering confidence, are nothing more than rotting meat. They cleared a path. They stood aside. They watched, left alone with their fear, their horror, their terror at being left alone in the darkness. As Xylan, that cackling monster, prowled through the broken landscape. He picked his way through the rubble until he reached a smooth, unbroken stretch of rock. And then he took off, running on all fours. When Xylan arrived at the tower, he was shocked to find that he wasn't out of breath. He had been running for ages, galloping for hour after hour, far longer than any single night should last. He had charged up the hill, shouldering trolls out of his way, trolls that seemed less taken aback by the joke, by the hilarity, by the laughter. The closer they drew to the tower. The godless monk had forced his way across that broken, barren landscape, and all the while, the entire way, without stop, he had laughed. He laughed and he laughed, cackling, roaring, filling the landscape with laughter and the trolls' hearts with fear as he dashed to the tower, that tall, unnatural tower, the one that stood overrun with churning, green flesh. He looked up at the tower, gazing at it in awe, overwhelmed by the beauty of its construction, though not so overwhelmed that his laughter ceased. No, he kept cackling, giggling, snorting in the darkness as he looked up at that smooth, unbroken tower, seemingly carved from a single cyclopean block of stone, perfect and uniform, all the way up to the top, where looked out 4 windows, filled with light. The room filled with light, and the tower filled with trolls, filled with the same stupid, ignorant, useless, disgusting, foul, vulgar beasts that filled the entire landscape, that filled the entire world, for all he knew. Was it all that this world held? Was this all the world would ever hold? His laughter grew louder. Of course it was. Of course it was. Of course it was. This was all that there was, all there would ever be. And the best part, the most hilarious part, the part that caused his stomach to convulse, to tie up into knots, that forced him to buckle, bend over, and gasp for breath. The best part was that this was all there had ever been. He roared with laughter. He laughed so hard he couldn't draw a breath, laughed so hard he thought he'd suffocated, thought he'd have to claw a hole in his own throat. And then the irony of that thought struck him, and he began to laugh harder. Harder and harder he laughed and he laughed until his laughter was undercut by something else. Something sharp and shrill and piercing. A scream. Screams. A woman's scream. The scream of someone, something. With intelligence, with a brain in her head, with knowledge, with a mind not yet corrupted by this awful, barren place. Someone who had yet to give in to the mindless destruction, to the inevitable destruction that defined that world. There was still someone, a real person, left in that world. So he forged ahead. He stormed the castle. He rushed into the crowded tower, packed with heaving, puffy green flesh, not because he wanted to save her, to rescue her from those ignorant, mindless marauders. No, not that at all. But because he wanted to see that misplaced soul, that poor, deluded fool who thought that there was any other outcome for her than what stared her in her face. He always could use a good laugh. He tried to laugh his way through the horde, but it was no use. As close as they were to the tower, actually inside of it, their hate was too strong for their fear to overcome. If they felt the horror he had taught to their brethren, it was only deep inside, so deep down that they could fight on, in spite of it. Xylan chuckled at the thought, at the inevitability of it. A hot, steaming tower full of terrified, furious fools, ready to tear something, anything apart. If not their target, then each other, and if not each other, then themselves. The trolls were emboldened, driven into a frenzy. So Xylan had no choice. He had to fight his way through. He had no choice. He had to do what they wanted, had to give them what they asked for. In the end, he too was a slave, the same as any other. He laughed. He was a slave to those vicious, cruel, shining masters. He was a slave to his teeth and to his claws, and worst of all, to the joke. He snarled, and he leapt into the fray. He stayed with his body for as long as he could, but after tasting the troll's blood for the 1,000th time, after hearing scream upon scream upon scream, layers of hate and fear and helplessness piled on top of one another, after feeling windpipes crush, skulls burst, and hearts stop over and over, he knew that if he were to keep fighting, then he could fight the truth no longer. He chose ignorance. He laughed at the irony of it, at the inevitability of it. He chose ignorance in a place where there was no choice, and he gave in to what rose up within him. He became the beast he'd feared he'd become. He became the beast he knew that he was. Xylan, that cackling monster, fought his way through the tower, fought his way up those stone stairs. He found them scorched by flame and left them slippery with gore. Troll after troll, he tore throats with his teeth. He gouged eyes with his claws. He kneed, punched, bit, tore, and rent. He destroyed. And in his wake, he left nothing but carnage and despair. Xylan loved the joke. He loved the laughter it elicited. But this was no joke. It was no laughing matter. This wasn't the cosmic absurdity that he delighted in. This was the universal truth that fueled it. The immutable law of nature, the one man worshipped at the altar of, the one that man struggled to subvert, the one that man fled from and returned to happily when given the chance, the one that had overtaken him, that had laid claim to his very being, the one that stated simply, definitively, that might makes right. Though he had no gods, the slavering, bestial monk, more animal than human, didn't just worship at that altar. He brought it sacrifices, fattened green calves slaughtered upon the thirsty stone, deep within that gleaming obelisk, the one that reached up boldly from that craggy tundra. He opened their veins. He tasted of the sacrifice. He judged it sweet, deemed it fitting, and he killed again. Again and again, he slaughtered his way to the top of that tower with laughter that became a cackle that became a howl, and a howl that became a death sentence for all those that heard it. Grinning, he stalked through the doorway. He was finally out of breath, struggling for air, not from laughter, not from exertion, but from the primal, murderous ecstasy that had washed over him. Panting like the satisfied beast that he was, he prowled on all fours into the single room at the top of that bloody tower. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't feel. And he couldn't think. But what he could do was see. And when he looked out upon that ruined, ravaged room, he saw the woman, the source of the scream, eyes shut, battered and bloodied, crumpled on the floor, motionless. He stared out with those big, black, empty eyes, and he saw it standing above her, teeth bared in hate, eyes clenched in fear. He saw it. The troll. And in its hands, a cauldron, a massive, heavy iron pot raised above its head at the precipice, at the apex, ready to come crashing down at a moment's notice. He glared at that grim, inevitable tableau, and he knew his place in it. He knew where he was and where he belonged. He knew what he must do, and he knew that might always makes right. He knew it because it had overtaken him. The ravenous urge, the bloody compulsion, the sanguine hunger. If you're digging Scald, please help spread the word in real life and online, especially with those iTunes reviews. Word of mouth is crucial to keeping this show growing and going. A few months back, I released the very first Scald ebook titled The One True King of Men. It collected the original prose of the show's first 16 chapters and is still available exclusively on Amazon for only $2.99. But as of right now, it is no longer alone. That's right, Scald Volume 2 by Blood and by Fire is now on sale, collecting chapters 17 through 32 of The Only Story That Matters, all for only $2.99. Buy both volumes and get 32 chapters of brutal sword and sorcery for less than $6. Just search for Scald on Amazon or use the link in the description below to make sure I get an even higher percentage of the sale. If you pick up the ebooks, I would love to hear about it on social media. Find me on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. Username Aubrey Sitterson. Or hit up AubreySitterson.com for links to everything, including Scald, the Scald ebooks, my comics writing, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more. My recommendation to you this week? That's right, you guessed it, it's Scald Volume 2 by Blood and by Fire. Please, pick it up, tell your friends, and most importantly, leave a review. Even if you don't buy the book, please, leave a review. Reviews are the only way for self-published DIY books like Scald to reach a wider audience, so let people know how much you enjoy it. So they are then compelled to check it out for themselves. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.